The dense forest surrounding the village of Ashburn seemed almost alive at night, with a magical quality that made it seem like the most wonderful place on earth. As the evening light receded, residents eagerly locked their doors and closed their windows. Staying out after dark was the ultimate adventure. There was a silent rule in the village that everyone was expected to follow. Stay safe and don't let the night catch you outside the house. Elena de la Croix was thrilled to be back in Ashburn after all these years. The village held many mysteries and secrets, just waiting to be uncovered. Years ago, her mother, Amelie, had mysteriously disappeared one night. All that was left was a wet footprint leading into the woods. No body had been found, no trace. That day was lost in the silence of the village. Now, Elena was ready to face her past. The old de la Croix house stood at the edge of the forest, weathered and covered in moss. When Elena stepped inside, a cold breath touched her shoulder. The trees outside were taller than she remembered, their curving branches reaching towards the house as if to catch her. The silence of her first night in the house overwhelmed Elena. Looking out of the window at the forest, she saw the dense fog curling between the trees, moving across the ground like fingers. The silence was so thick she could hear her own breathing. She sighed and tried to sleep, but in the depths of the night, the suffocating silence was broken. Her eyes suddenly opened, her breath caught in her throat. She recognized the voice. It was her mother's. But it couldn't be. He sat up quickly and switched on the light. The room was empty. She told herself it was just her imagination. But that night, the whispers did not stop. Every hour, they came back, starting softly and then getting louder, more insistent. The sound echoed off the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Elena curled up in bed, her body covered in cold sweat, shivering until dawn. The next day, he went round to every corner of the house, looking for traces of his mother before she disappeared. In the old marriage room, he found strange symbols carved into the walls. Spiraling words, sharp lines, as if written in a language of traces. His mother had never told him about these symbols. That night, the whispers grew louder. This time, they weren't just saying her name. She heard broken sentences, a language she didn't understand. The darkness suffocating the room, even the faint atmosphere of the lamp, had dissolved. Single quotes Elena. You have to listen. Single quotes. With trembling hands he picked up his phone and switched on the torch, but the whispers did not diminish. He walked slowly through the house, the cold, damp air clinging to his skin. The whispers seemed to be leading him towards the attic at the back of the house. When he reached the narrow corridors leading from the attic, the light in his hand weakened. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, darkness reigned everywhere. In the corner he saw movement, a spindly figure. Elena. She froze. The person standing in the corner was her mother. But her mother was not as lively as before. Her skin was strained and her eyes were full of tears. She was dressed in a dirty dress, as if she were dead. Her eyes were empty, but fixed on Elena. Elena's breathing quickened, as if collapsed in the darkness of life. Her eyes were fixed on her mother's pale face. What confronted her after all these years was too strange to be real. But the negative presence, this thing was a shadow left behind by her mother, nothing more. "Mom," Elena whispered, the words catching in her throat. Amelie's movements were heavy and dull, almost like parts of a machine. As she turned her head, bare feet made a high-pitched sound that echoed on the floor. Her eyes stared at Elena, her piercing gaze enveloping the soul with an icy fear. Elena. Single quotes Amelie whispered, her voice almost a reflection from the depths of the tomb. "I'm still here." An indescribable chill ran through Elena. It was not the warm, protective voice of her mother. It was filled with deep pain, anger and an otherworldly body. "The forest took me, but I never left." "Let the darkness," the words echoed from Amelie's lips as if she was building a bridge to other worlds, like a muffled, staccato moan. Elena's eyes filled, her throat tightened. "Why didn't you come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. But deep down, she felt she already knew the answer. There was no going back. Amelie's face grew darker in the shadows, her features as bleak as the dead she had unmasked. The depth of her eyes drew Elena in. "I wanted to try. Single quotes Amelie said, her voice even more hoarse, a cold reflection from the depths of a tomb. "But the darkness. It won't leave us." Elena, her voice broke into a strangled sob, icy but full of pain. The darkness has kept me here. It will take you. The word sent a shiver through Elena. The area in the attic suddenly felt heavy, as if the walls were closing in on her. Her chest tightened as she breathed in, dark shadows reaching out from around the corner to swallow her. As his eyes traveled through the shadows, a cloud of mist, heavy and shapeless, moved like a being. It was somewhere towards the shadow sickness. It was as if the entire room had melted into those components. As Elena's mind raced, a light blinked from the mirror in the corner, an eerie light that shone like the only living thing in the room. Elena turned back to the mirror and saw her own presence there, but this reflection was alien to her. The eyes were empty, and there was a sinister, menacing smile in them. At that moment she felt something inside her break. It was not himself. His reflection took a step towards him. The malevolent look in his eyes deepened and he smiled. Dark whispers began to spill between her teeth. Elena felt that her face in the mirror did not belong to her, but would soon possess her. The darkness in the mirror, its hand reaching out towards her. The mirror turned into a sea of darkness, stretching like shadows across the room. The whispers became clearer and clearer, the room swirling like a dark vortex. The whispers echoed in Elena's mind, now sent. Elena ran out of her room, screaming in terror. As she ran, she could cling to the pieces as they came. The darkness loomed over her like a shadow, coming closer and closer as she drew her breath. That night Elena managed to escape from their quarters, but she knew she could not escape completely. The darkness wanted to take her, just as it had taken her mother. No matter how much she ran, the darkness was after her time. In her step, in her shadow, she felt its presence. And most frightening of all, one day the darkness would overtake her completely. Now send ... single quotes, the whisper said, in a cruel tone that was etched in Elena's mind. Those words echoed in the depths of her brain, carrying her to the depths of collapse. Screaming, she ran out of the room, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floor, everything going faster and faster. Your heart was pounding like it was going to burst out of your chest. Your brain was open in the vastness of its compartments. The darkness follows him like a shadow. The shape was changing before his eyes. His healing was getting closer and closer. There was no longer just a darkness. There was a living, breathing presence that wanted to engulf her. Elena kept running. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, her lungs were burning, her eyes filled with tears. She felt that she was being pursued by those behind her who dared to go on, but who kept going. A gloomy silence radiating from the forest covered everything. The whole world was lost in this accumulation. Even the wind was silent. Only shadows moved, a curse circling around Elena. As he ran, his feet stumbled, but he kept going. The darkness was about to reach him. With his breathing it was as if darkness filled his lungs, shadows reaching out, pulling him in. Fear dilated his pupils, hissing on his skin at the touch of the tracks in his step. Deep in the forest, the collapse of a moment. It was as if the world had suddenly stopped, as if everything in Elena's life had stopped moving. But in that stillness, she knew that something was dragging its presence towards her. The forest had become a tomb of darkness, and Elena was about to be sucked into it. All that was left was to remain in the darkness. Everything, her voice, her light, had disappeared, and those on the ground were left to their ominous whispers. Elena survived that night, but it haunted her. The darkness wanted to take her the same way it took her mother. No matter how far she ran, no matter how far she traveled, the darkness was always after her. It had become her shadow, a being that followed her step by step, patiently waiting for its time. We are preparing to set out one day to absorb it completely. Elena may have survived that dark night, but she did not leave their souls after that day. The darkness was with her every step, every breath. Echoing in whispers, lurking in shadows, the darkness lived to finally overtake her. With each passing day, it grew deeper and deeper inside Elena, patiently plotting, waiting for the right moment for the dark night to return one day. When that day came, Elena's soul was fighting to surrender completely to the darkness, but the battle was becoming more and more difficult with the growth in her body. The darkness was waiting for Elena's moment of weakness. It was impatiently biding its time to wait for her.